This is a very unaligned presentation, by the way, so apologies for that in advance. We're going to talk about how we can use unbundling to help mitigate and stop sandwiches through disincentivization. This is something that we've been doing for almost a year now on Polygon Proof of Stake, and we're very pleased with how that's been going. But first, what is a sandwich attack? It is typically a bundle of 3 or more transactions, but as in a sandwich, there is a top and a bottom. Notably with a sandwich attack, we have the front-running portion from the searcher, which is when the searcher will buy whatever token the user is buying. But this is characterized by the fact that because they are buying whatever the user is buying, they are incurring slippage, by design, but they're also paying fees, not just gas, but also pool fees and swap fees. And that's very important because that first transaction, that front-running transaction, is what's called a loss leader. It's something that loses money through fees, but the searchers are intending to recapture that with that final transaction, the back run at the very end when they recapture the profit. So what is a good way to think about sandwich attacks, or really just trading in general, to be honest? I like to think of it in terms of rate deltas. Price impacts would be another effective way to think about it. If you're looking at visualize a line where you've got the current pool rate on one end of the line and the rate plus whatever the user's max slippage is on the other. You've got 2 things that are moving the rate of the pool during that process. You've got the user's price impact, and then later on we've got the searcher's price impact. Mentally though, I want you guys to keep in mind that the fee plays a role here. So mentally remember that there is a fee that is working against the user's slippage. And so when we're looking at how the sandwich attack happens, like what sort of math is the sandwicher using, how are they calculating their volume, etc., it's important to keep in mind that the price impact is a function of the volume and liquidity, but price impact really is just a rate delta, right? And so what is the sandwicher trying to do? Well, if you go back to here, the sandwicher is trying to solve for the delta between this point and that point. They're trying to solve because that is what their own price impact is going to do once they initiate their trade. So they're going to come in, they're going to do their buy, then the user's buy happens, but then the sandwicher also has to sell back on the back end. And so the general idea here is that this is their average buy, this is their average sell, this is the sandwich spread. No pun intended, although I'm pretty proud of that one now that I say it out loud. And so the general idea is that the sandwicher wants to buy low, sell high, right? But the sandwicher still has to pay fees. And so when you look at the fees, the general idea is that the sandwicher wants the sandwich spread to be greater than 2 times the pool fee. That's the rough, very oversimplified. The math is actually way more complex than this, but if you simplify it just a little bit, then you get like a very reliable model, which is what this is. So what do sandwichers like? Well, they obviously like it when the slippage is greater than twice the pool fees. And so you can see here a graph, sandwich or EV, or expected value on the y-axis, user slippage on the x-axis. The greater the user slippage, the higher the profit for the sandwicher. Inversely, sandwichers like low pool fees. The lower the pool fee, the higher the expected value of the sandwich attack. Sandwichers also like volume to an extent, but keep in mind that rate delta model that we were looking at. If the user does more volume, that's going to be more price impact from the user's trade, which means that the sandwicher's own trade, their own price impact is going to be smaller, right? Because the sandwicher is solving for the rate delta that's remaining. And so more volume means less of a remaining rate delta for the sandwicher. And so to a degree, sandwichers like volume because it means they can do a larger trade. But as that volume increases, the sandwichers start to realize that, hey, their own volume is not going to be that great. And inversely, just like we had slippage and pool fees, the inverse of volume is liquidity because, again, price impact is based on volume and liquidity. And so what we'll find is that sandwichers do like pool liquidity to a degree, but at a certain point, it becomes something that is cutting into their own ability to capture profit. What do sandwichers like most of all, though? Winning. Sandwichers like winning. And at the end of the day, because that first front-running transaction is a loss leader. It's something where if just that loss leading transaction lands on chain and then their own backrun doesn't actually win, then they lose money, right? And so one of the main things that sandwichers are looking for is this concept of bundle atomicity. It's very, very important for sandwichers because without bundle atomicity, they run the risk of losing money. That's very, very important to them. They don't want to lose money. And it's something that can cost them a lot. If you think back to, I want to say this was like March or April of this year, there was the low carb crusader who has the current high score for sandwich unbundling profit. They were able to capture $25 million by bamboozling the MEV relay, MEV boost, and sandwiching the sandwichers. Captured $25 million. I would argue that the sandwich attackers should have set a lower slippage setting, but because of the way the low carb crusader went about tricking the relay, it really was an exploit. It's not really a hero story as some people make it out to be, because it was a security vulnerability that was breached rather than just game theory. But there is something here, which is that by unbundling these sandwich attacks, by taking these sandwich attacks and plopping them down in the mempool so that other sandwichers can sandwich the sandwichers, that makes sandwiching a very, very risky business. So one of the things that people ask is, but sandwiches happened before flashbots, right? And so you think back to pre-flashbots, pre-MEV relay, there was this concept of the mempool. Everyone had to go through the mempool. And so one thing that I've heard a lot of people say is that latency advantages would give the fastest sandwicher an acceptable minimum win rate, which is to say that the fastest sandwicher would have high confidence in bundle atomicity because they would have high confidence in winning. And then that fastest sandwicher would be able to do mempool sandwiches, and this would lead to MEV centralization. That's not a bad way of thinking. That is logical, but in reality, transaction propagation in the mempool is way too random for any sort of latency advantage to be reliable. And the reason why I say that isn't because sending to the validators is random, it's because it's the listen time. It's not time to send, it's time to listen. That's extremely important when it comes to not just sandwiches, but all transaction-based MEV. And knowing when you will hear about a transaction relative to when your competition will hear about a transaction is an extremely uncertain thing and extremely random because of the way that the P2P layer in Ethereum is programmed. This graph, it's not the easiest one to read, but you can see this is roughly how many nodes hear about a transaction over time. And you've got negative 220 milliseconds on that end and roughly 260 milliseconds on the far end. So roughly 500 milliseconds from one end to the other. And you can see a lot of variability. If you're looking at sandwich bots and just bots in general that are doing their own calculations in sub 1 millisecond, that much variability just in time to listen is a huge amount of variability. And that's what really ruins latency advantages as a reliable source of win rate. But there is one thing that doesn't need a latency advantage at all, and that's this concept of bundle atomicity through an inventory monopoly. So let's take an example where you've got a sandwicher and they've got a 3-transaction bundle. The first transaction is buying a coin. The sandwicher buys the coin. Second transaction is when the user buys the coin. And then the third transaction is when the sandwicher sells the coin. We would see a lot of these types of sandwich transactions pre-flashbots. It's very common. But what's odd is that if you actually go back 3 years ago and you look at the blocks, you'll notice that this first transaction is a top of block transaction, and it usually pays a very high gas fee. This was pre-1559, so it would be like a very, very expensive, obviously a priority gas auction style of transaction in order to buy this ABC coin. Meanwhile, the user's transaction would be 14th or 15th transaction in the block, and then the sandwicher sells would be the one following the user buy, typically. And so the real question becomes, why was there so much gas money being spent by this first one? And the answer is because back then, sandwichers didn't hold shitcoins in inventory. And usually with these shitcoins, there was only one pool to buy the coin in to begin with. And so whichever sandwicher was able to buy the token first at the very top of the block would have exclusive inventory access. And they would exclusively be able to be the only one that could do this third step, to sell the shitcoin. And so if you're thinking about it in terms of competition and how multiple sandwichers are competing to try to backrun each other, well, if only one of them can do the final step, that's the value maker, that's where the competition is. And so bundle atomicity was extremely important. And so the general idea is that that was a huge blocker 3 years ago for a lot of sandwichers. But these days, Jared from Subway, his whole edge, his alpha is based on token sniping. And you've got multiple copycats popping up where they will go out into the market, and a lot of their edge is just based on getting these shitcoins as soon as they pop up. And what that does is that gives them inventory, not just so that they can do things like this, they're not that noble. Really what they're going for is this ability to do this cheaply, because to your point, what if there is other sandwichers? They can always buy in a different pool, right? If there's multiple pools around, it's expensive. It's gas. That's something that's going to put more pressure. They're also going to have to pay more pool fees that way. And so it's one of these situations where these days, just based on how hyper competitive the sandwich market is, we're seeing much more inventory of just horrible tokens being held. And interestingly enough, the profit to these sandwich bots usually way outweighs the carry risk that they hold. So what do we do on Polygon? I run FastLane on Polygon, and we are big believers in intentional unbundling. We're not trying to do any sort of exploit or anything like that. All we're really trying to do is shine a light on the dark forest. And the way we shine a light is by taking every MEV bundle that we get and just broadcasting all of it out into the public mempool. It's sort of an unbundling by design approach. And what this does is by broadcasting all transactions and all MEV bundles to the public mempool, we create this scenario where if there is a MEV bundle from the first searcher, and then we've got this second searcher, searcher B over here, searcher B can always take searcher A's bundle, remove searcher A's backrun, and input their own backrun. And the fascinating thing about this design is that searcher B will always have a more profitable bundle than searcher A. And the reason why is because searcher A is paying swap fees here. Searcher A is also the one paying swap fees here. And so because of this, searcher B, really from searcher B's standpoint, they're not even trying to sandwich a sandwicher. They're just backrunning two separate buys. And the interesting thing about sandwich attacks is that they really fundamentally are not identifiable and in any sort of deterministic way, right? It's not something that you can be hey, that's a sandwich attack. Sometimes you can if they make it easy, but if sandwichers had to, they would be able to disguise themselves through Sybil, through multiple EOAs, etc. And so what we found is that this sort of game theory approach where we intentionally unbundle has led to, so far we have been running for a year. We've got roughly 40% of the Polygon hash rate connected to us. We haven't seen a single sandwich attack come through our relay. And we are very, very proud of that. And what's more, you might notice there's a tiny bit of red there. That's actually, we did some investigation. This was actually really fascinating. It's actually fake sandwiches. There is a bot on Polygon that is intentionally sending these fake sandwiches, trying to get another bot to sandwich the fake sandwich. And those are actually done using salmonella tokens, which is an exploit. So you don't want to actually sandwich that sandwicher. But yeah, no, it's this really fascinating thing where Polygon proof of stake is a very sandwich-free environment. I'm not going to say it's perfectly sandwich-free. Technically, someone could do a sandwich. We're not. There's no way for us to block it. We can only strongly disincentivize it. There's one thing that I think is really important, though, and that's latency races. We had talked before about latency races with the mempool and how the mempool is quite random, which leads to latency not being a reliable edge. But once you add in an MEV relay, like what Mike was talking about earlier, MEV relays are designed to be fast. They're designed to take out a lot of the randomness of the propagation of the P2P layer. And so MEV relays are just naturally not random. And so we just made ours random. Very, very inelegant solution. Very much a, dude, just trust me kind of thing. On Polygon for PFL, the way that our auctions work is they're by default 275 milliseconds long. It's very short, but Polygon searchers are used to being pretty fast, so that's fairly okay over here. We have a random modifier though. We increase the auction duration anywhere from 1 to 50 milliseconds, and it's just random on the fly. And the way, like the reason why we do this is like, what is the attack vector? The attack vector is just-in-time sandwich bidding. If a sandwicher knew exactly when an auction would end, then they could sneak their sandwich attack in at just the last second, knowing that they could get it in and that the auction would end before any other sort of bot were to see the transactions broadcast in the mempool. And so what this 50 milliseconds of randomness does is it nukes that. And the reason why we chose 50 milliseconds is because we wanted to have a time where we were confident that the transaction could go out, the bots could respond to it and get other transactions back in. And that is the presentation. Ludwig?
Right.